Now that we finished cutting a post, let's move on to a beam. If you're looking at the cut sheets, I've pulled out the cut sheet for beam 1-3, and we'll start by laying out and cutting the tenon. I've got the model that we used the other day. Just to give you an idea, this is our objective. You'll notice that the tenons on the beam are identical at each end, so we'll just walk through cutting one of them. The tenon is centered on the beam, and we have this cut on the bottom to create the half dovetail that fits into the post. Like we did with the post, you want to spend a little bit of time looking at the beam and deciding where it's going to live in the building based on whether it has an outside face or not, and also looking at defects in the beam, both structurally and aesthetically. And then the last thing you want to do is take a look at the crown of the beam. Most of the timbers that you buy will have a natural bow up, and depending on where it's located in the building, you typically want to have that bow located up. Wood is prone to creep, so over time, under load, it will tend to straighten out. So if the beam starts like this, when it gets loaded, it will tend to approximate a straight line. You don't want to start with your timber with the bow down, because it will just get worse over time. These 3 tie beams actually have a support post in the middle, so the crown is not that important. But to crown a timber, you would get down like this and look down the length of the timber and see if there's a noticeable sweep in one direction or the other. This timber is pretty straight, so I'm not going to worry too much about the crown. If it had a very pronounced crown, I would like to orient that up, even though there is a post in the middle to support it. So looking at the cut sheet, you can see that the length of the tenon on the top of the beam, and I'm going to call this the top, is 8 inches. I'm using chalk, which is very easy to remove, so I'm going to make marks everywhere and not really worry about them being permanent. I'm also going to put an arrow on the end of the beam indicating top. So my arrow is simply pointing to this surface. That way, as I'm rolling the beam, I don't get confused and lose my place. This timber has already been cut to length, so it's exactly 288 inches. So I can just hook the tape right on the end and measure in, give myself a tick mark at 8. Rather than measuring from this edge back 7 inches, just in case this is slightly out of square, what I'm going to do is put the framing square on there and transfer that line to the other side, just like we did with the post. We use the framing square to transfer our lines all the way around because it's more accurate than taking a second measurement on the post, and in this case on the beam. Now that I've transferred this mark straight across, I can measure forward 1 inch, which will give me the 1 inch offset that we created on the post. And now I can just connect the dots. I'm going to use the scoring knife, and just to reiterate the point about the correct order of marking. When you're starting out, we recommend that you do all of your layout in pencil. When you start to get more comfortable, you might want to transition to just using the scoring knife for all of the layout. It is a slightly crisper way to lay things out, but know that it's a real commitment. Once you've scored something, it's much harder to remove that mark. After I've scored it, I'll take the pencil and just put a little graphite in that score so that it's more visible. You should note that of all of the work that we do on the post and the beams, this line and the mating surface on the post is the most visible in the end. So you do want to take your time and get this very crisp on both parts. All right, I'm going to roll that up so that I can lay out the tenon on the top side. So following the sequence that you see on the cut sheet, I've rolled the timber toward myself once. So now I'm looking at the top view. And if you look over on the right-hand side, you'll see that we have a 2.5 inch wide tenon that's centered on the end. So the first thing I'll do is take my framing square, and I'm registering off of the first line that I drew. Remember, I measured back 8 inches. And I'm just going to use the framing square to transfer that line across. Because the tenon is located in the middle, I want these lines to be discontinuous. That's a good way to indicate to whoever is cutting this that we don't want to cut all the way across the beam. Now I'm going to find center and work out from both sides to lay out the tenon. Again, I like to bring the framing square away from the end. If I make the marks for center right here and I'm off a little bit, that will skew the tenon. If I come well away from that, find center and make the marks. If I'm off a little bit here, that error will be minimized because I'm further away. So I've got the timber centered between the 1-inch mark and the 9-inch mark. 5 is center, and I just measure 1 1/4 inches to each side. I'll do the same thing on the end of the timber. And down here on the bottom. You want to have lines all the way around the timber because you need to know where you're slicking to ultimately. Here's center, 1 1/4 to each side. And again, now I'm just going to connect the dots using the scoring knife. I'm also going to score these lines for the shoulder cut of the tenon. Across the end grain, I don't bother scoring. There's no harm in scoring, but I don't find that it's very effective on the end grain. So I'll just mark it with a nice sharp pencil. All right, now we've got the layout complete. I'll drop a little graphite into these score lines. And we're ready to roll again. Since I've rolled the timber again, I'm now looking at this view, the south view of beam 1-3. Basically the timber is upside down. So I have the top here and the bottom is here. Remember that the top of the tenon was 8 inches long. I have a line that I just drew on the top side, and I'm just going to transfer that line across and again create my 1-inch offset. The tenon here is 1 inch shorter, so I'm measuring from my 8-inch mark back 1 inch. And now I can just connect the dots with the scoring knife. And I'll put a little graphite in that to make it clear. One more roll and we'll lay out the bottom of the tenon and we'll be all set. At this point I have lines drawn on 3 sides of the timber. Remember that I started my layout here and then I drew a square line across what was the top side of the timber, and then I did my offset line on this side. I just want to double check that those lines meet square across the timber. So while it's tempting to just take a straight edge and connect those 2 lines, to double check the accuracy of your layout, you always want to put the framing square on and make sure that these 2 lines that you have drawn are square to each other across the timber. And because this is Hollywood, it turns out that they align. Last thing I have to do is lay out the tenon. Again, just like on the top side, it's a 2.5 inch wide tenon that's centered. So I'm going to come well away from the end, find the center of the beam, 5 inches, and measure 1 1/4 inches to each side. I don't need to do that here because I did it in a prior step. I already have the lines drawn, centered on the timber. So again, it's just a matter of connecting the dots, and I'll use the scoring knife to do that. This line across the bottom, and unlike the top, we're going to be making a cut on the bottom of the tenon, so I am going to draw this score line all the way across. The cut that we make here on the tenon will create the half dovetail shape that mates with the post. All right, at this point the layout for the tenon is complete. I'm just going to lay it on its side and we can start cutting.
Hey there, thank you for watching. Here at Shelter Institute in Woolwich, Maine, we teach a wide variety of house building and timber framing and carving classes. We'd love to see you here, but if you can't make it to Maine to take one of our classes, our online class is available at shelterinstitute.com.